Over the last few years, there's been a truly sad epidemic that's been exposed, and one that's killing people or condemning them to maybe a lifetime of prescription pharmaceuticals. And that's an epidemic of suicide, addiction, anxiety, and depression. And fortunately, there's been a lot of research and work done around psychedelic compounds to help those people that are suffering. And one group in general that's seeing a lot of benefit are our post war victims, specifically our veterans who sometimes come home with severe PTSD symptoms. But what about the other victims in a post war scenario? Those civilians who are left to literally put back the pieces of their homes, of their lives, of their families, communities, and even country. How could psychedelics help them? You're watching Mind Shifting Moments, and this show was created to help destigmatize psychedelics. And that happens through transparent conversation and by getting answers to your questions from experts who are hands on in the field every day. I'm your host, Margaret Williamson, head of partnerships at Nucleus, and we're a venture studio that works to create brands that aggregate data, educate people, and activate customers inside of the psychedelic experience. And our big question today is, how could psychedelics help Ukrainian civilians? And to help me answer that question and shed some light is a great expert, the CEO and founder of Homecoming Health, Yuriy Blokhin. Please help me welcome him to Mind Shifting Moments. Hello, Yuriy. How are you?
Hi, Margaret. Thanks for inviting me here. Great to meet you.
Oh, thank you. You too. And again, I was telling you before we started just how excited I am to have a conversation like this. Um, why don't you have a vast resume? And I don't usually, it's not focused primarily on what you do for work, but your experience and your expertise in the marketplace and industry. But there's such an overlap here with your work with the Heroic Hearts Project and with Homecoming. Give us a little bit of an introduction, if you will, on your experience in the industry.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, just for the broad context, I grew up in Ukraine, but I moved to Canada about 20 years ago to study mathematical physics at the University of Waterloo, and just ended up staying in the upon graduation, ended up staying in the tech sector, in the tech community, ended up working on a number of pretty high impact products, including some of the kind of larger scale mental health care technology products like a safety net could support millions of teenagers in mental health distress across a variety of social networks. And that kind of defined my career in terms of like, I want to I would say like that defined my career in a way where I decided to commit the rest of it to building technologies that work at scale to support mental health needs for people in distress. But in parallel to all that work, like really, there was a personal journey for about 17 years with psychedelics, and like after immigrating to Canada from Ukraine, I struggled with depression, and like it was only by working with psychedelics I could find relief from that depression. And at some point 10 years ago, I decided, okay, I want to do something. How can I do this work in a more structured, in a more kind of in-depth manner? And discovered, luckily for myself, the amazing indigenous tradition in the Amazon, working with ayahuasca plant medicine, and went to Peru. As many people in this ecosystem, in this community, I can say that that trip to Peru and work with ayahuasca saved my life. And since then, I was in this kind of deep personal quest. How can I support the graceful introduction of these medicines into the fabric of modern culture in a safe, responsible, and culturally sensitive manner? And so I was kind of seeking for that way, seeking for that opportunity. And about 6 years ago, I joined a nonprofit called Heroic Hearts Project as the founding team member, working alongside Jesse Gould, the creator of Heroic Hearts. And Heroic Hearts is now a leading nonprofit in this space, helping veterans with PTSD access psychedelic medicines. We primarily focused on ayahuasca over the years, even though we did work with psilocybin and ketamine medicines as well. But we really are kind of, the roots are in ayahuasca work. And through this work with veterans from the UK, US, and Canada, we kind of consistently saw time over time that the bottleneck to lasting sustainable results was preparation and integration psychotherapy and the whole kind of continuous therapeutic container that is possible for a person going through this work. Because transformation doesn't happen overnight or even in a few ceremonies, even though some of it can happen in a few ceremonies. But to make that last, you do need this continuous work. And Homecoming, my project, my company has emerged really as a kind of labor of love from that kind of nonprofit work. And now Homecoming is a technology platform working across the spectrum of various psychedelic medicines, across the spectrum of settings, clinical and more traditional, supporting practitioners with the integration and preparation work for their clients. And lastly, in terms of the way Homecoming has been kind of ideated and structured, is that you kind of see the roots of this community coming from the nonprofits and people like Rick Doblin, Amanda Fielding, Ben DeLonnen from iSeries, like really pushing this work for decades. And so when we organized Homecoming, we decided to kind of structure it in a way that gives back immediately to the nonprofits that have created this community. So 10% of the equity in the company was donated and gifted to these nonprofits, to 10 nonprofits in the space. Some of them I mentioned, Beckley, iSeries, MAPS, some of them are smaller, like Heroic Hearts or Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, but we believe it's not only a way to share benefits, possible benefits if there is success, but also it's a way to hold ourselves accountable to the vision of how the whole ecosystem can evolve and develop and benefit from this work. So that's Homecoming.
It's wonderful. You know what I mean? It really, it's just bravo that you let that transformation into changed behaviors. And now your changed behavior pattern is going to affect millions. And I want to talk specifically about that transformation, right? And how that comes about through the use of psychedelics, but specifically how you've seen it help so many of people that find themselves in this post-war traumatic situation. You know, I don't want to call it the wrong thing, but maybe you can give us some examples of transformation that you've seen in some of these of our veterans that have been able to access the medicine, and what that could do for anyone that's kind of suffering from similar symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Like what we have seen as a pattern, as a consistent pattern with many people suffering from various war traumas, is that the current support system, the current safety net has utterly failed them. The VA system in any of the countries, like US, Canada, UK, is very bureaucratic and doesn't really have the tools that are capable of effectively dealing with severe trauma and PTSD. And typically the prescriptions that people receive are very often actually making things worse and like driving the destructive behaviors. And there's a high degree of comorbidity, addiction, anxiety, depression, and PTSD all going hand in hand. And basically, when we have been starting the work at Heroic Hearts, we just saw really that like there's no other option to help for the majority of these people. And the other aspect that was really kind of aligned with this style of like working with plant medicine is that being successful working with psychedelics like requires a high degree of agency. You kind of really need to kind of take matters in your hands and kind of take on a more active role in your own healing, versus, for example, in the contrast, say taking a pill and hoping that this will like really be the kind of the root of the healing. And we have seen a very receptive audience with that mindset when it comes to the veteran community, especially people who have tried various options and they saw that none of the other options work. That's where Heroic Hearts has found it to be very effective and successful. And that was like the number one thing we've been screening for in our initial kind of intake questionnaires. Like, is there a pattern of evidence that this person was consistently trying to take matters in their hands, even though things were rough and intense and maybe really dark, but are they really trying to kind of maintain that agency in their healing? Because if the answer is yes, then there was a really high chance that we could help them by providing access to ayahuasca and other plants. And on the third dimension of like what kind of stands out to me is the core pattern is the high degree of reliance on community. We have seen that people who go through the military experience, or even more broadly through an experience of war, there is an element of high reliance on community and peer-to-peer support. And we have seen that's like very important from a perspective of healing, and even from a more even pragmatic perspective of scaling and being able to help even more people, because there's only so many therapists in the world, and there's just not enough of them. So that's where I found the war trauma sufferers are actually very organically prone to like have these systems of reliance on community and peers. And that was another lesson of Heroic Hearts Project: community and peer-to-peer support.
So interesting. I think that's so a great, mind shift that's happening there, that, where when you see a failure in your support system around you, those people that you thought were there to take care of you can no longer service your needs, to, that you still have agency though. So thank you for pointing that out. And, when we think of even a talent agent, right, this is someone that's going to go out and procure you work, right? If you can take your own agency, if you're still out there looking for solutions, then psychedelics can be a great path for you. And then if there is this community and peer support around you, and I think that's so interesting that Homecoming is creating that, even if virtually, for people. How then, once you've found, these veterans who are exhibiting, those kind of three major things, they become part of the Heroic Hearts program. And what transformations, how does the medicine help them do things that these other pharmaceuticals and these other protocols weren't able to do?
Yeah, well, the unique part about working these medicines is that like there is no single path of how they're experienced, and as many as there are sessions or ceremonies or people, as many there are trajectories. But on a kind of more foundational level, like the pattern that kind of stands out to me in my own work and what I've seen is that when working with ayahuasca and other psychedelics, you're able to kind of re-experience and in a somewhat dramatic manner kind of reintegrate parts of you that have been hidden deep within your subconscious mind, and because they've been maybe too painful to feel through fully, or you haven't been really equipped to feel through them when you have encountered that traumatic event. As traumatic events could be big or even tiny, they're still kind of like they could be fracturing your sense of self and psyche. And with psychedelics, you're able to go deep and experience those things that you wouldn't normally be able to experience because you're kind of uncomfortable about that. But also when going through this experience in a kind of in a safe and skilled environment facilitated by a trained professional in either of the traditions, that's when you can have a safe transformational container to actually experience those feelings, let them out, have a release, a moment of release of some kind, and experience a greater sense of whole self and bring that back into your day-to-day life. And that's where the work of integration will also begin, to maintain that sense of self, sense of wholeness for a longer period of time, rather than like in a dramatically unsustainable case. It could be more like a flash in a pan experience where you have a temporary sense of wholeness, but it doesn't stick around for too long because you come back to fully kind of unprepared environment around yourself, which doesn't support your long-term change and integration.
So it does seem like, right, anyone that finds themselves in kind of this post-war trauma situation would benefit from this type of treatment. How would something like that become a reality? If we think about, okay, we want to facilitate this type of therapy for civilians in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and I would just start my answer maybe with a caveat that I wouldn't say that everybody should kind of take psychedelics and or would benefit. I think there's definitely a screening process for any psychedelic medicine, and while many can benefit, not all should work with them. There are counterindications, and yeah, that's just like a caveat there I want to put out there.
Oh, that's good to say that. Thank you. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but in terms of like how can we take the lessons of like Heroic Hearts Project and apply them to the work with the Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees and veterans. So just for context, even before the war has started, I was already invited to be part of the Ukrainian Psychedelic Association, a new team, a new organization that was like forming around like a year ago for the first time, with the goal of taking the lessons and clinical trials and learnings from the kind of Western ecosystem and applying them within the Ukrainian regulatory environment, and eventually descheduling and rescheduling some of the medicines like MDMA and psilocybin. Just for your reference, currently ketamine is already legal to use in Ukraine, and also ibogaine happens to be actually in the gray area where it's not scheduled, probably simply because of omission.
Yeah.
And so there are people operating in that sort of gray zone simply because it's not formally scheduled. But the organization, the UPA, was already working on kind of developing their own clinical trial when the war has started, which kind of has reprioritized everything, and kind of it has created a lot of trauma and suffering, and also created a lot of kind of a bit of a new mindset when it comes to how the government in Ukraine has been operating since the war has started. You can really think of the community there now, both the people in the policy as well as also like the civic society. It's a startup nation. Like they don't have time to look for these kind of 10-year plans and go through slow processes that get your result in 7 years. Like people are thinking quick on their feet and willing to make changes very rapidly as long as there is some result. And so that's sort of the mindset that's like dominant right now in the policy circles there too, and which is opening a unique window of opportunity to make some nimble moves and introduce psychedelic infrastructure for Ukrainians much sooner than otherwise would have been possible. And so in that environment, our team has launched a number of initiatives. There are educational initiatives that are working with influential Ukrainian celebrities, athletes, musicians, artists, policy people, anyone who really has a platform and is willing to share their thoughts on the positive potential of psychedelics. And we have been pretty successful in attracting some pretty cool names in that community. The marketing campaign has not been yet formally launched, so we're still in the building that 100-person list phase, but it's going to be pretty visible. Well, secondly, we also have engaged some of the heavyweights in the broader and the global psychedelic community. So I want to express gratitude to Rick Doblin from MAPS for personally supporting this work and allocating a number of scholarships for the first cohort of therapists, Ukrainian therapists who will be trained in MDMA psychotherapy. And they're just starting their training now. Those are displaced these are all female therapists who are displaced, who are refugees in Western Europe right now. So they'll be training while being physically in Western Europe. And the purpose of that initial training cohort will be that like they'll be able then to take their skills and then train other Ukrainian therapists and create a mycelium effect and kind of seed the initial generation of psychedelic therapists in the country. And then thirdly, we would like to apply some kind of bit of a magnifying lens to this process of training this first cohort by running also a clinical trial, so that then we can actually not only train this seed cohort, but share the results with the broader community and policy circles in Ukraine. And so we're currently organizing the trial. It will be held in the Netherlands at one of the government psilocybin centers. And this initial cohort of MDMA therapists during the appropriate phase of their training will be providing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to a group of Ukrainian refugees, a group of women who are in the Netherlands right now, who are civilians. And the goal is to obviously train the therapists, record the studies in the trial, and then apply this model to both convince the policy circles in Ukraine, but also take that model and scale across other European centers where this work can be possible. And so that we can keep getting more therapists who are trained and keep helping more refugees who are currently in Ukraine. Primarily, this would be women, because men cannot leave the country right now in case there is further waves of mobilization. And as we build this evidence, a unique moment can come a year from now once MDMA is formally approved by the FDA in the US. The cool thing about the Ukrainian regulations is that there is a reciprocity act. So the moment the FDA approves it in the US, automatically MDMA will be kind of reciprocally recognized in the Ukraine as an approved drug for PTSD. And that's where we can kind of use the results from the trials to then like run a much bigger fundraising campaign to build out the infrastructure for civilians and for veterans alike. And honestly, in my kind of long-term dream vision is that like not only can this help with the recovery of civilians and veterans in the Ukraine, I think over time this can create a frontier nation of psychedelic therapists and infrastructure providers who actually can attract people from other countries to come there for treatments and create more revenue for the country too, which could be quite important in the post-war recovery. So that's sort of the long-term vision and step-by-step session.
That's wonderful, right? I mean, I'm glad that you thought about it. In my head, I'm like, okay, how can we do this right now? And, you know, are there ways, you know, you brought up, and I don't think that really clicks for a lot of people, that the men can't leave right now. And so all of these refugees that have been spread across the world are all women and all children. And, you know, that we need to think about the support that they will need as they're raising the future of the world, right? It's not just future Ukrainians. It's like now they have, you know, they're integrated, they're displaced, so they're becoming parts of society. And how will they be able to raise these children, hopefully from a better place mentally, you know, being able to process some of this trauma. But is there something we could do for the men that are on the ground now? Is there, you know, you mentioned that ketamine is legal in the Ukraine through your, you know what I mean? I'm just thinking here, right? Like through the use of your app that we could get and other telehealth platforms potentially doing sort of like group therapy sessions?
No, it's a good question. I would like to err on the side of caution. And for example, for those men who are like in active duty and maybe say coming back for a vacation, I would say like you need a more stable environment to kind of get into this line of work, into psychedelic therapy work. Because if you have to go back to the front line, say a few weeks later, it's just you don't have that space to decompress and do proper integration. So it can only be actually re-traumatizing potentially. So I think other mental health approaches, non-psychedelic mental health approaches in the meantime could be deployed. And that's where another nonprofit called Heal Ukraine Trauma that I'm on the board of, like where we're kind of building these more like peer-to-peer support networks for people suffering from trauma, war-related trauma, and like teaching coping skills from based on the work that has been already done in other war zones. And so that's where maybe non-psychedelic options could be more immediately applicable. While psychedelic work could potentially be done after the war is over when it comes to people who are in the country right now. And the role of homecoming in all of this that I see is that like how can we support the practitioners, therapists, and coaches alike to kind of scale themselves, scale their therapeutic container, because the challenge will be of unprecedented magnitude, and anything goes in terms of like helping this practitioner to like save 1 extra hour, 5 extra hours of their time per month, so that they can like help one more person, 2 more people with the integration and preparation. And that's where kind of like where I see the role of homecoming, streamlining the therapeutic process, streamlining the therapeutic container, creating these peer-to-peer connections so people can rely not only on the provider but also on peers, and gathering data and gathering insight for practitioners to know like what can be done the next time they see the client, and informing their next session. Yeah, I think that's the answer.
Yes, no, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And, you know, I want to circle back, and because I had a mind shift as you were speaking again with that. And it's, you know, this question, you know, how could psychedelics help Ukrainian civilians? And, you know, the reality is that it can potentially help all civilians if it's right for you, right? If you're someone who's suffering from certain symptoms and you're not finding relief, you kind of knock off the indicators that you spoke of earlier, then it's not just about it being Ukrainian, right? You can fill that in with any population of people. But specifically, when we talk about the big concept of that, how important it is that we're creating the infrastructure, that we're creating something that's going to have a firm foundation so that it can be replicated and, grow its own legs and reproduce future generations of therapists and people that are educated on the right premises. So thank you so much for sharing all of that insight and vision. And for those people that want to get involved in either the specific program for Ukraine or with Heroic Hearts or with Homecoming, what's the best way for them to take agency of that?
Yeah, there are a ton of ways to get involved. If you do have a history of your own, the kind of war trauma and overcoming of that, both Heroic Hearts and the Ukrainian association, we're building a community of peers, a community of coaches, people who can act as that safety net for each other, as others are just starting their journey working with psychedelics or working with therapies. And that sort of peer-to-peer community is only going to kind of get bigger and more critical over time, because again, to help everyone who needs it, there's never going to be enough therapists. There's never going to be enough clinics. It has to go beyond that kind of more restricted environment. And then in terms of both Heroic Hearts and the Ukrainian Psychedelic Association, like donations, big or small, like I think for the Ukrainian mission right now, there's like a pretty compact and specific project of fundraising for that first clinical trial that will kind of measure the efficacy of that MDMA therapy treatment for refugee women in the Netherlands. And that will be sort of the foundational pillar of the rest of the program. And so we're raising for that trial right now. Like both MAPS and the local retreat center have provided their resources at cost. So we just need to basically cover those kind of basic at cost needs and to get the refugees in place, to get the therapist in place and run the trial. But it's a very reasonable amount that we're raising towards, of $250,000 in total of, and there've been already quite a few people in the ecosystem, the psychedelic community, who are excited to help. And similarly with Heroic Hearts, like the crisis in the veteran community is not slowing down. I'm not sure if there's this statistic of on average there being 20 veteran suicides a day in the US, and so like that's not changing. That has been like that for a while, and so there's no shortage of veterans who need help, and there's no shortage of veterans who definitely have a sense of agency to take matters in their hands if only provided with an option. And what Heroic Hearts does is offering scholarships to work with plant medicines to take agency. And like I said, there's rigorous screening around like who gets that scholarship to make sure that a person who is motivated and willing to do the work is prioritized in the queue. And so when donating to Heroic Hearts, you can rest assured that there's a very high likelihood that you are saving somebody's life by this donation. And the whole organization is run by volunteers, so there's really no administrative or bureaucratic overhead, which is typical for large nonprofits. It all goes to help veterans.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Yuriy, for sharing your time, sharing your experience, and sharing your vision with us today. I know my mind was shifted, and if you're listening and your mind was shifted as well, make sure you share that in the comments and connect with us throughout the ecosystem. If you've got an idea for a mind-shifting moment question, make sure you come in contact with me and let me know. But we will see you next week. Thank you, guys.